Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. Last week, while attending a conference in Boston, I had the opportunity to visit the John F. Kennedy Presidential Museum. It's a beautiful museum, and I highly recommend it if you're ever in the Boston area. The museum, of course, offers a fascinating look back on our nation's 35th president. But what really struck me while visiting this museum was that John F. Kennedy was one of the first presidents of the television age, and he really knew how to use this new technology to deliver inspiring speeches. And although it's been over 60 years now since he was elected, I'd like to talk today about how John F. Kennedy still speaks to the new generation. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about John F. Kennedy's influence on my own life as I was growing up. Now, I was born after President Kennedy had died, but I could tell he still cast a huge shadow over my school teachers, many of whom were teenagers or young adults when he was president. I remember in particular Mr. Yannick, my 8th grade U.S. history teacher, who had pictures of Kennedy on our classroom wall, and how he once poignantly shared his own memories of our 35th president during the anniversary of his assassination. It was clear to me that John F. Kennedy, with his youthful image and energy, more than any other president, had a profound influence on an entire generation of young Americans. Of course, we now know that President Kennedy was far from perfect. He kept serious health problems hidden from the public, and he was quite the womanizer while in office. But none of this diminishes the fact that he really knew how to inspire people through his speeches. He was perhaps the most gifted public speaker of any president. And today, I'd like to talk about 3 of my favorite speeches of his in particular that I believe still speak to the new generation. The first speech I'd like to talk about is his inaugural address, delivered on January 20th, 1961. The most famous line from the speech was, quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." But the focus of the speech was actually on what America would or should do for the rest of the world. In January 1961, there was still the height of the Cold War, and also the height of American prestige and dominance. The new young president wanted to reassure the world that the United States still stood for freedom. And in his address, he declared, quote, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, and oppose any foe in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." Quite a bold statement, but it guided U.S. policy through the end of the Cold War. And although it may have seemed dated after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, today, as war has broken out again in Eastern Europe, and with tensions rising with China, Kennedy's speech invites us to re-examine America's role in a dangerous world where large countries armed with nuclear weapons are once again testing each other's will and resolve. But Kennedy had another problem. While he was fighting for freedom abroad, many of his own countrymen were oppressed by racism and injustice at home. America in the early 1960s was still a country where millions of its black and other non-white citizens suffered from blatant systemic racism, particularly in the South, where segregation and Jim Crow still reigned. Now, Kennedy was no champion of segregation. In fact, quite the contrary. But he was also a Northern Democrat, and he was reluctant, at least during the early part of his presidency, to risk antagonizing the Southerners of his own party over civil rights. But as the civil rights movement, led by men such as Dr. Martin Luther King, began to gather steam, protests and demonstrations started erupting across the southern states, sometimes resulting in violence. Kennedy could no longer show restraint when it came to civil rights. So in June 1963, he gave a very important speech on civil rights. In this speech, he did more than just talk about a better future. He also reached back to the past for moral foundations. He began the speech by reminding us that the United States was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. He framed civil rights not as a legal issue, but as a moral issue. My favorite line from this speech was, quote, "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is old as scriptures, and it is clear as the American Constitution." Now, tragically, Kennedy's life was cut short in Dallas just 5 months after giving that speech. He was in Dallas partly to mend fences with Southern Democrats who thought he was pushing for civil rights too fast. And although he didn't live to see the passage of the Civil Rights Act the following year, it was Kennedy's speech and his actions on civil rights that brought this country even closer to its founding principles. So, if you're a young person today still fighting for civil rights and equality, I invite you to listen to President Kennedy's speech on civil rights from June 1963. But Kennedy did more than just speak out for peace and freedom on this planet. He also literally inspired his countrymen to reach for the stars. Perhaps his most enduring legacy that will still be remembered hundreds of years from now is that he inspired and challenged America to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the earth. It's sometimes hard to believe that it's now been 50 years since the last man walked on the moon. Imagine how much harder and more dangerous it must have been to try to accomplish this feat back in the 1960s. On top of the technological challenges, people have always asked the question, why spend billions going to the moon when we have so many problems to address here on Earth? Well, Kennedy answered this question in a famous speech delivered at Rice University 60 years ago this month, in which he boldly proclaimed, quote, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure that man has ever gone." Now, sadly, Kennedy didn't live to see men land on the moon just 7 years after giving this speech. But as America today now prepares to return people to the moon in the next few years, we can still turn back to Kennedy and his words and why we choose to go to the moon today and do the other things that are hard. So in summary, defending liberty abroad, fighting for civil rights at home, and exploring the heavens are 3 important areas where President John F. Kennedy challenged us in the 1960s and where he can still continue to inspire us today through his speeches. I put a link to each of those speeches below. Perhaps they will speak to you and your children as well and inspire you to finish this unfinished work. In closing, I would like to share President Kennedy's reminder in the closing part of his inaugural address, in which he said, quote, "All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, or even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin." Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.